Hi there, my name is Brian Tulloch. I'm going to do a presentation today on Brown versus Board of Education, Topeka, Kansas, the history of it and the impact it's had on the United States educational system. It's going to be a short 15-minute video, so it's going to move rather quickly. But the PowerPoint will be here for you to look at it later, and I've added some additional resources for you to go delve into. So we're going to jump right into it. All right. What was Brown versus Board of Education, Topeka, Kansas? It was a landmark 1954 Supreme Court case which ruled unanimously that racial segregation was unconstitutional. It was one of the cornerstones of the civil rights movement and helped establish the precedent that separate but equal education was not, in fact, equal at all. All right. To do this, we're going to look at the history of racial segregation in the United States leading up to Brown versus Board of Ed. All right. So the first event that has a major impact is the Civil War. The Civil War ended slavery. It gave us the Civil War amendments. Primarily, the one that pertains to education is the 14th Amendment, which strengthened the legal rights of newly freed slaves, and that no state should deprive anyone of their due process of law or the equal protection of law. Since everyone should be equal under the protection of the law of the United States. We would come to find out this necessarily wasn't true, especially when it came to education. All right, so the Civil War is 1855. It ended. So for the next 40 years, um, African Americans did make some headway. But in 1896, a huge court case, Plessy versus Ferguson. Essentially, Homer Plessy was a black man who wanted to get on the bus in Louisiana and he challenged a separate but equal. This court case made it all the way to the Supreme Court, and it ruled that equal protection clause it didn't violate the equal protection clause, which established in our country this idea that separate but equal facilities was okay. The issue became that separate facilities were not always equal. So what did this mean? It set a system in our country that it was not equal. So let's look how it pertains to education. So when we look at in the 1930s, for example, we have black teachers were paid $510, white teachers were paid $833, not equal. Only a handful of black schools in the South. That's not equal opportunities to education. Black schools were overcrowded, usually one classroom. The education for blacks and whites was not equal. So this led us up to this court case, Brown versus Board of Education, Topeka, Kansas. All right, so what led up to it? Here are a couple of events that we can look at that led up to it. 1899, Cummings versus Board of Education. It held up a school board's decision to close a free black school due to financial constraints, although there was two public white schools, not equal, right? Separate but equal, not so much. Berea College versus Commonwealth of Kentucky held up a law forbidding interracial instruction at all colleges, so not same access to colleges. Over the next 30 years, there's this fight to get equality. We have a couple of cases that kind of push us there. State of Missouri versus Gaines in Canada. Supreme Court decided in favor of Lloyd Gaines, who had refused to admission to the University of Missouri Law School. And then Sweat v. Painter, a black student, Herman Sweat, found superior at the University Law School was superior to his black school, which had been in a downtown basement. So there's not equality by any means. And then this led up to McLaren versus Oklahoma State Regents, where the University of Oklahoma admitted invalidated a requirement that a black student be admitted to a graduate program to him at the black school, sit in separate sections of a school adjacent to the courtroom, classroom, library, and cafeteria. These important cases all led up to Brown versus Board of Education, Topeka, Kansas. All right, so there's one individual and one group that helped push this case. Thurgood Marshall and the NAACP. In 1909, the NAACP was founded. In 1939, Thurgood Marshall became the special counsel for NAACP. In 1948, Thurgood Marshall and the NAACP decided to vote its efforts to solely all-out attack on segregation rather than pressing for the equalization of segregated facilities. Why? Because for the last 50 years, from 1896, separate but equal was not equal. So the only way to get equality was through segregation of public schools. All right. So there's actually 5 court cases that led up to Brown versus Board of. It was actually 5 court cases that were encompassed all in Brown versus Board of Education. So there was one in South Carolina, one in Prince Edward County, right down the road from where I live, one in D.C., Delaware, and then the big one in Topeka, Kansas. Move this down for you so you can see. Linda Brown was a 7-year-old third grader who lived blocks from the white school, but she had to go to a school across town that did not offer the same educational value. So all this led up to the big case, Brown versus Board of Ed, 1954. And the decision stated unanimous decision. That's key. Everyone voted for that. And the opinion was wrote by Chief Justice Earl Warren. The court noted that public education was central to American life, calling it the very foundation of good citizenship. They acknowledged that public education was necessary to prepare children for the future professions and enable them to actively participate in the democratic process, but was also a principal interest in waking the child to cultural values present in their communities. Justice has found it very unlikely a child would be able to succeed in life without a good education. Access to such an education was thus a right, but which should be made available to all on equal terms. Wow. Key takeaways. Public education central to American life. Principal instrument in awakening a child to cultural values. Unlikely a child would be able to succeed in life without a good education. A right which would be made available on all equal terms. Pretty impactful stuff. So, in theory, we're going to see some equality. As we'll see later on, as we delve into a few other things, we're still dealing with that equality today. All right. So how does this court case affect students' learning and then and now? So we're going to look at learning, students, and schools and see how it was affected in 1954 and see how it's affected now. All right. In 1954, students, Brown Board of Ed entitled students to receive a quality education regardless of their status. It set down the foundation for the civil rights movement and gave hope that separate but equal on all fronts would be changed. Students of color now have the opportunity to receive the same quality of education as white students. And without Brown versus Board of Ed, we have no idea how long it would take for these schools to be integrated. Pretty important, pretty big deal. So let's look at students now. Are schools really integrated? So if we look at this study from the National Coalition on Educational Statistics, the percentage of public and elementary school students enrolled in schools with at least 75% minority enrollment. Here's our big number. In 2000, 3% of white people went to minority schools. 6% went to schools in 2017. So as of 2017, less than one out of 20 students in a minority school is white. When we look at the numbers in Hispanics and blacks. So is there really integration in public schools today? Again, up for debate. All right. In schools in 54, they knew that some school districts would not want to integrate, so they came out with Brown versus Board of Education 2 in 54, which said you had to do it quickly. It had to be done with deliberate speed. What was the problem? Many white schools in the South did not want to integrate schools in Prince Edward County, and they shut down schools, public schools, and made schools private schools for whites only. So in 54, schools, what was happening? In 57, the Little Rock Nine, where the President Dwight Eisenhower had to bring in the National Guard so that 9 African American students could go to a white school. These kids were spit on, thrown at, disrespected. In 10 years after, 98% of black children in the South attended segregated schools. So 10 years later, nothing. And in 64, here's a big deal. Griffin versus Board of Ed, Prince Edward County again. Court instructed that they the local district to require authorities to levy taxes to reopen and operating a non-discriminatory public school. So a huge fight when this court case happened, a huge fight to integrate these public schools. How about now? Well, let's look at schools in 1954. One of the big negative impacts of Brown versus Board of Education was that a lot of black teachers lost their jobs. In 17 prior to Brown, 17 states had segregated schools. 35 to 50% of the teaching force was black. If we look at it now, 7% of public schools and 11% of public schools principals are black. Okay. What does that say about this decision? A lot of integrated schools kept the white teachers, and a lot of highly qualified black teachers lost their jobs. Let's look at schools now. According to the United States Department of Education Office for Civil Rights, all these statistics tell me black students represent 18% of preschool enrollment, but 48% receive more than one out-of-school suspension. Black students are suspended and expelled 3 times more than white students. Does that sound like fair? We can get into a huge debate why this is, but if we're looking at from an equality standpoint that Brown and Board of Ed was supposed to help, there's not equality. There's by no means equality when it comes to discipline in schools. How about learning? Let's look at learning now. In a recent analysis of 97,000 public schools in the United States, the Department of Education found a pattern of inequality on a number of fronts. Race as the deciding factor. High schools with high percentage of African American Latino students had fewer course offerings associated with college prep and access. African Americans, Latinos were more likely to have students with first-year teachers and teachers who did not meet all state requirements. So if we're looking at from an educational standpoint, an equality standpoint, just this as of now, there's no equality. They don't have the same access to education, and they don't have the same access to qualified teachers. How about achievement gap? Let's look at the achievement gap. Wasn't Brown versus Board of Ed supposed to close that achievement gap? Well, according to this, the percentage of white fourth grade students scoring at the proficient level on educational progress tests of reading is more than twice that of Hispanic and African American students. This gap grows wider by the 8th grade and even wider by the 12th grade. So there's still a gap, still a huge gap in educational equality among white students, African and Hispanics. And how about this? Let's look at this. This also deals with the achievement gap. The big number here is that of 2012, white, black, and white Hispanic achievement gaps were 30-40% smaller than were in the 70s. So yes, we're making progress. That's great. But however, the gaps are still large, ranging from 0.5 to 0.9 standard deviations. What does this mean? It means that if we look at national educational numbers, white students score higher than Hispanic students and black students when it comes to achievement. So if Brown versus Board of Ed was supposed to close that educational achievement gap, we're still far away from where we need to be. All right, let's look at some key takeaways. Historically significant event that claimed education was anything from separate but equal. It gave students, regardless of race, access to the same educational opportunities. Good things. Segregation in schools some bad things. Was not mandated in 54, and many school districts fought segregation of schools for over 10 years. Schools today are not fully segregated, and achievement gaps remain very high amongst different races in 2020. So the big question comes, did this court decision accomplish its intended goals, and what can we do as educators? In a very brief answer, initially, yes, it accomplished its goals. What did it do? It ended school segregation. It gave opportunities that were not there prior to this court case. It, in theory, made everything equal. Long term, no. Based on numbers, facts, statistics, we still have huge educational gaps, and a lot of black teachers lost their jobs and never went back to the profession. As educators, we can do more, and we need to do more, and realize that Brown versus Board of Ed was the start, but almost 75 years later, we still have a long way to go. All right, here's some great resources I've included. Implicit Bias, 65 Years Later Legacy, Black Educators, a huge webinar, Fulfilling the Promise of Brown. I hope that this gave you a brief introduction to Brown versus Topeka, Kansas. Thank you so much and have a great day.